The summer of 1944 smelled of burnt wheat and high-octane gasoline across the hedgerows of Normandy. Two armies were moving in opposite directions at speeds their grandfathers could never have imagined. Yet one of them was moving with exactly the same technology their grandfathers had used at Waterloo. On the American side, you heard the constant, overlapping thunder of thousands of 2.5-ton GMC trucks, Detroit's heartbeat echoing across the French countryside. On the German side, you heard the wet, exhausted breathing of 2.5 million horses, the creak of ungreased wagon wheels, and the dull slap of hooves in ankle-deep mud. They were separated by only 50 miles of shattered villages and shell-torn orchards, but they belonged to completely different centuries. Germany had started the war with 2.8 million horses and had never found a way to fight without them. Every infantry division required between 5,000 and 6,000 animals just to move its ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and artillery. A single horse consumed 10 pounds of grain and 20 pounds of hay every day, 30 pounds of fodder in total. Multiply that by 6,000 horses, and you needed 53 tons of fodder per division every single day before you even began to feed the men or supply the guns. By the late summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht was devouring the agricultural heart of Europe simply to keep its animals alive. French and Belgian farmers watched their entire hay harvests disappear into German requisition wagons while their children went hungry. America, by contrast, had landed in Normandy with fewer than 6,000 standardized 2.5-ton trucks specifically allocated for the pursuit phase. 6,000 trucks to keep two field armies, over 1 million men, 40 divisions, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces supplied across a continent. On paper, it looked insane. In practice, it was about to become the most decisive imbalance of the entire war. On the morning of 25th of August 1944, inside a commandeered chateau near Chartres that served as 3rd Army headquarters, Lieutenant General George S. Patton was pacing in front of a giant wall map covered with sweeping red arrows. His tanks had advanced 400 miles in 30 days, an operational tempo that made Blitzkrieg look leisurely, and now everything had simply stopped. Patton slammed both fists on the map table so hard that coffee cups jumped. "We are winning this damn war at 30 miles an hour, he roared, "and some pencil-pushing son-of-a-bitch in the rear wants me to slow down because he can't count gasoline." His supply officer, Colonel Walter Muller, stood pale and rigid. "Sir, the railheads are still 200 miles behind us. We are currently delivering 31,000 gallons a day to the entire army. Your armored divisions alone are burning close to 400,000 gallons every 24 hours. Patton stared at him as if the man had just confessed to treason. "Then find me 400,000 gallons, he said in a voice suddenly quiet and far more terrifying than any shout, "or I will personally court-martial every swinging dick between here and Cherbourg until somebody does." That same week, 50 miles to the east, a German regimental commander in the retreating 7th Army scribbled a desperate entry in his diary outside the ruins of Falaise. "Another 180 horses lost today to artillery fragments and sheer exhaustion. We shot the worst cases and distributed the meat among the men. The remaining animals are beginning to stumble. The troops look at them the way starving wolves watch a wounded deer." A French farmer named Henri Duval stood at the gate of his small farm near Argenton and watched two different wars pass by within the same hour. First came the Americans, an endless column of olive-drab GMC Jimmies roaring eastward, headlights blazing even in daylight, horns blaring, black drivers waving and grinning as they thundered past at 40 miles an hour. 15 minutes later came the Germans retreating west. A slow, broken procession of horse-drawn wagons tilting in the ruts, animals frothing at the mouth, soldiers walking because there was no room left on the carts, the road already ankle-deep in fresh manure. The old farmer crossed himself and whispered to his wife, "Mon Dieu, one army is running away from the future and the other is racing straight into it." By the final week of August, Patton's 3rd Army, until then the sharpest spear the Allies had ever driven into the German flank, ground to a complete halt. Not because the enemy had rallied, not because the tanks were destroyed in battle. They stopped because the fuel tanks were empty. Sherman tanks sat silent on country lanes with their long 75mm guns pointed forlornly at the sky. Artillery batteries counted their last shells. Infantrymen opened cold sea rations and stared east toward the Rhine that had seemed so close only days earlier. In that sudden silence, the entire momentum of the European campaign hung by a thread no thicker than a rubber fuel hose. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, General Dwight D. Eisenhower received a signal that chilled him more deeply than any report of a German panzer counterattack. Third Army immobilized for lack of gasoline. Situation critical. Urgent, repeat urgent. Eisenhower turned to his logistical commander, Major General John C. H. Lee, known to friend and foe alike as Jesus Christ himself, Lee because of his initials and his limitless self-confidence. "John," Eisenhower said, "if Patton stops now, the whole damn war stops. Give him what he needs or we lose the greatest opportunity we will ever have." Lee nodded once. In the back of his mind, an idea that had been simmering since D-Day suddenly ignited. He reached for a thick red grease pencil and drew a single bold line on the operations map from the landing beaches at St. Lo all the way to the forward railhead near Chartres, almost 400 miles of ruined French roads. Along that line he wrote 3 words in capital letters: Red Ball Express. What no one yet understood was that the war had just entered its decisive phase, and that phase would not be fought with tanks or infantry or even air power. It would be fought with trucks, with drivers who had never fired a shot in anger, with mechanics who could rebuild an engine in a ditch under a tarp, and with a nation that believed movement itself could be industrialized. On one side stood 2.8 million horses, eating Europe into famine. On the other side stood 6,000 trucks and the young men, many of them black soldiers who still could not vote in their own country, who refused to let those trucks die. This is the story of the moment the 20th century collided head-on with the 19th century at 60 miles an hour, and the 19th century shattered like old wood beneath the impact. A single drop of gasoline falls in slow motion from the spout of a 5-gallon jerry can, catching the light like a ruby against the French dust. And so began the greatest supply race in human history, one fought not with bullets, but with wheels. The idea was born in desperation, scribbled on the back of a ration carton at 2 a.m., in a smoke-filled room at the Advanced Section Communications Zone headquarters in Le Mans. Colonel Loren Ayers, a soft-spoken transportation officer from Kansas, who had spent the pre-war years moving refrigerators across the American Midwest, stared at the map until his eyes burned. Around the table sat a dozen exhausted staff officers who had not slept properly since June 6th. Ayers tapped the red line he had just drawn and spoke the sentence that would save the Allied campaign. "Gentlemen, we are going to run a truck route straight to the front, 24 hours a day, closed to all other traffic, priority above everything except blood plasma and the mail. We will paint red balls on every vehicle so the MPs know not to stop them for anything short of God Almighty himself." No one laughed. No one argued. They were too tired for either. They simply nodded and reached for their coffee. The Red Ball Express was officially activated at 0001 hours on 25th of August 1944. Within 48 hours, 132 truck companies, nearly 6,000 vehicles, and almost 20,000 men were pulled from every port, depot, and replacement pool in northern France. Most of the drivers were black soldiers from the segregated transportation battalions who had spent the summer unloading Liberty ships under German shells. They had been told their war would be fought with crates and winches, not rifles. Now they were handed the steering wheels of brand-new GMC Jimmies and told, "Drive until the front moves faster than you do." Private First Class James Rucard, 21 years old, from Detroit, remembered the moment he first saw the red disc painted on the windshield of his truck. "It looked like a target," he later said. "Turned out it was a promise. Training was whatever you could learn between the beaches and Chartres. They taught the city boys how to double clutch on bombed-out roads. They taught the country boys how to read a French road sign at 50 miles an hour in the blackout. They taught everyone the same 3 rules. Keep moving, keep 30 yards between trucks, and if you fall asleep, you will kill the man behind you." Meanwhile, 300 miles to the east, the German supply system was devouring itself. Oberstleutnant Hans Meyer, a quartermaster with the 9th Panzer Division, filed a report that never made it past Army Group because no one wanted to read it. Daily fodder requirement for divisional transport now exceeds daily bread ration for the troops by a factor of 3. Horses are being fed the thatch from French roofs. Mortality rate 11% per week and rising. Meyer ended the report with a sentence that would have gotten him shot 6 months earlier. We are attempting to conduct mobile warfare with the logistics of the 30 Years' War. On the night of 28 August 1944, the first Red Ball convoy rolled out of the Normandy depots. Headlights were forbidden, so each truck carried a small blackout marker and a driver who had not slept in 36 hours. They moved in pairs, nose to tail, engines roaring through villages that had never heard anything louder than a horse cart. French civilians stumbled out in their night clothes, crossing themselves at the sight of this endless mechanical serpent winding through the darkness. One old woman in Alençon shouted after them, "Les camions du diable," the devil's trucks. The name stuck. James Rucard was on that first run. He carried 5,000 gallons of aviation gasoline for the fighter bombers that were supposed to be covering Patton, but had themselves run dry. Somewhere south of Le Mans, his radiator hose burst. Steam exploded across the windshield. The truck behind him nearly rear-ended him. Rucard leapt out, burned his hands on the manifold, and patched the hose with chewing gum and a strip of inner tube while the convoy slowed, but never stopped. When he climbed back behind the wheel, his hands were bleeding, but the truck was rolling again. "That was the night I understood," he later said. "They didn't need heroes, they needed motion, and motion was all we had to give." By the end of the first week, the Red Ball was delivering 12,000 tons a day, more supplies in 7 days than the entire German 6th Army had received in a month at Stalingrad. But the cost was brutal. Drivers were limited to 4 hours of sleep in every 24. They ate at the wheel, peed into cans, and learned to catnap with one foot on the clutch. Amphetamines, officially called energy tablets, were handed out like candy. One company commander wrote home, "My boys look like ghosts with grease instead of skin." Segregation followed them even here. White officers rode in jeeps, black drivers rode in the cabs. White troops guarded the depots. Black troops drove the trucks. When a driver was killed, his body was wrapped in a shelter half and left at the nearest aid station because the convoy could not stop. James Rucard saw his best friend from basic training die that way outside Chartres, steered into a ditch to avoid a burning truck ahead, rolled, crushed. They buried him in a roadside grave with a helmet for a marker and kept rolling. "We didn't have time to cry," Rucard said. "Crying slows you down." German commanders watched the dust clouds on the horizon and could not comprehend what they were seeing. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach, captured in the Falaise pocket, was interrogated by American officers who asked him why the Wehrmacht had not pursued more aggressively after Normandy. Eberbach laughed until he cried. "Pursue? With what? We were trying to find oats for the horses while you were flying gasoline in from England. Your trucks never slept. Our horses had to." Back on the Red Ball, the mechanics became the real magicians. They worked in open fields under canvas tarps, rebuilding engines with parts cannibalized from wrecked vehicles. A broken transmission meant swapping it out in the rain with hand winches and curses. One sergeant claimed he could change a GMC clutch in 43 minutes flat. They painted the new parts red so the drivers would know they were fresh. Red for danger. Red for speed. Red for do not stop. On 5th of September 1944, exactly 11 days after it began, the Red Ball Express delivered its first complete day of fuel to Patton's forward elements, 350,000 gallons in 24 hours. Patton himself drove to the forward dump, climbed on a crate, and told the exhausted drivers, "I don't care if you're black, white, or polka dot. You just handed me the keys to Berlin." The drivers were too tired to cheer. They simply climbed back into their cabs and turned west for another load. No one knew it yet, but the war would be decided by teenagers behind the wheel. The Red Ball Express did not run on daylight. It ran on darkness, coffee, Benzedrine, and the stubborn refusal of young men to let the war slow down. By mid-September 1944, the route had grown into 2 parallel one-way highways of destruction. Northbound trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition racing toward the front at 40 miles an hour, southbound trucks empty and rattling back to Normandy at 55. The road itself was dying under them. French asphalt, never designed for endless 6-ton axles, cracked and sank into the underlying dirt until entire sections resembled plowed fields. Dust in dry weather, bottomless mud in rain. Every convoy left behind a wake of broken springs, shattered differentials, and men who had not seen their own reflection in a week. James Rucard drove the night shift now because the night shift was worse, and worse meant you mattered more. He had learned to tape his eyelids open with medical adhesive when the Benzedrine wore off. At 2 a.m., somewhere south of Reims, his convoy ran into a German night fighter, a lone Ju-88 that had been hiding in the clouds since D-Day. The first burst of 20mm cannon fire stitched the road like a sewing machine. The truck ahead of Rucard simply disappeared in an orange blossom of exploding aviation gasoline. Rucard stood on the brakes, felt the Jimmy skid sideways, and then the second truck behind him slammed into his tailgate at 40 miles an hour. Metal screamed. The world flipped. When he crawled out through the shattered windshield, his left arm hung useless, and the road was on fire in both directions. He dragged the driver from the truck that had hit him, a 19-year-old kid from Alabama named Willie Davis, who was screaming for his mother in a voice that did not sound human. Rucard slapped him once, hard. "You ain't got time to die, Willie. We still got gas to deliver." They abandoned both trucks burning in the ditch and climbed into the next one still rolling past. The convoy never stopped. That same night, 200 miles east, a German artillery regiment tried to displace after dark and discovered that half its horses could no longer stand. The animals had been under shell fire all day, standing in flooded fields with no fodder since morning. One by one, they folded their legs and lay down in the mud, eyes rolling white. The gunners shot the worst cases with Lugers to end the screaming, then harnessed the living to the 105mm howitzers and attempted to drag the guns backward by moonlight. Progress. 4 kilometers in 8 hours. By dawn, the regiment was overrun by American armor that had received its fuel only 12 hours earlier via the Red Ball. The surviving Germans surrendered beside the carcasses of their own transport, too exhausted even to raise their hands until ordered twice. The Luftwaffe attacks grew more desperate as September bled into October. Pilots who had once hunted tanks now hunted trucks because they finally understood what the trucks were doing. Convoys learned to scatter at the first drone of engines overhead, drivers leaping into ditches while 50-caliber machine guns on ring mounts answered back with red tracers. One driver, Corporal Roosevelt Johnson from Harlem, kept a running score painted on his door. 27 missions, 6 confirmed aircraft claimed by the convoy gunners. He never fired a shot himself. He just kept the wheels steady while the boys in the back did the shooting. "My job," he said later, "was to give them a stable platform, same as holding a ladder for a man painting a house." Breakdowns became a second enemy. A thrown rod, a cooked transmission, a shredded tire, any one of them could snarl an entire column for miles. Mechanics worked miracles in the dark. They carried acetylene torches on the running boards and could swap an engine block in under 2 hours using a tripod hoist made from battlefield lumber. Spare parts ran short, so they began stripping wrecked trucks on the southbound lane to feed the northbound ones. A mechanical cannibalism that kept the artery pulsing. One maintenance company commander issued standing orders. "If it rolls, patch it. If it don't roll, strip it. Nothing dies on my road unless I personally shoot it." Sleep became the rarest commodity on Earth. Drivers learned to nap in 10-minute fragments while riding shotgun, head lolling against the window, only to wake when the truck lurched over a crater. Some tied strings from their wrists to the steering wheel so that if their hand relaxed in sleep, the wheel would jerk and wake them. Others chewed coffee grounds straight from the can. The medical officers handed out little blue tablets with the casualness of candy. "Take 2 and keep the war moving, son." The crash when the pills wore off was brutal, but the crash always came on the return trip when the truck was empty and lighter. On the German side, the collapse accelerated. In White Russia and Poland, the Wehrmacht had already lost more than 1 million horses to the Russian winter and partisan attacks. Now France was finishing the job. A veterinary report from Army Group G in October 1944 recorded that the average weight of a German artillery horse had fallen below 800 pounds, emaciated skeletons still expected to pull 2-ton loads through mud. Fodder parties sent behind the lines were ambushed by the resistance. Entire wagon trains vanished overnight. In desperation, some units began slaughtering their own mounts for meat and trying to move ammunition with human-drawn carts. The sight of German soldiers bent double under A-frames, dragging 88mm shells through the Vosges Mountains became common enough that American intelligence officers stopped bothering to photograph it. It was no longer intelligence. It was simply the new normal. By the end of October, the Red Ball had moved more than 412,000 tons of supplies across 48 million vehicle miles. That is enough distance to drive to the moon and back 96 times. The trucks themselves were falling apart, tires bald, engines knocking, frames twisted. But the men refused to let the system die. They began painting new mottos on the doors in whitewash. When we stop, Patton stops. And we haul ass so you can kick ass. One driver from Chicago simply wrote, "In God we trust, all others pay cash," and then added underneath in smaller letters, "Gas only, no checks." German intelligence finally grasped the magnitude of what they faced. A captured operations officer from the 7th Army, when shown aerial photographs of the endless truck columns, went pale and whispered, "Mein Gott, they have motorized their intentions." He was not talking about tanks. He was talking about the supply line itself as a weapon. Winter was coming. The roads would freeze, then thaw, then turn into axle-breaking ice. The trucks would need chains. The horses would need shelter that no longer existed. Two systems, one built on internal combustion, the other on hay and muscle, were racing toward the same cold, hard truth. Germany ran out of horses. America refused to run out of motion. On the morning of 29 October 1944, the sky over Chartres opened like a broken faucet, and the rain fell in sheets so thick that windshield wipers could not keep up. The Red Ball Express had been running for exactly 65 days without pause, and every man on the line knew the arithmetic was turning against them. Trucks were down to their last layer of tread. Engines were burning oil faster than gasoline. Drivers were seeing things in the mist that were not there. Ghost convoys, phantom bridges, friends who had died weeks earlier sitting in the passenger seat. Yet on that same morning, at a forward fuel dump near Verdun, a single nozzle began pumping gasoline into the lead tank of the 4th Armored Division. The tank commander, Colonel Bruce Clark, watched the gauge climb and felt the same jolt he had felt the first time he ever fired a 76mm round in anger. He turned to the exhausted Red Ball driver who had delivered the load and said only 4 words, "Son, start your engines." Patton's 3rd Army woke up. The tanks that had sat silent for weeks suddenly coughed, caught, and began to move. First a platoon, then a company, then entire combat commands. The sound rolled eastward like a moving earthquake. The shriek of turbine starters, the clatter of tracks, the roar of Maybach and Ford GAA engines that had been starved for 2 months. By noon on the 30th, the 4th Armored was across the Meuse River and driving hard for the Moselle. By nightfall, the 6th Armored had punched through the German screen at Nancy. The front, which had congealed into a sullen stalemate of wet trenches and empty fuel drums, exploded back into motion. Patton stood on a hill outside Verdun with binoculars pressed to his face and laughed out loud, the sound carrying over the artillery like a madman's benediction. Behind the spearheads, the Red Ball drivers watched the horizon light up with the flashes of American guns, and knew, for the first time with certainty, that every sleepless night, every burned hand, every friend buried in a roadside ditch had been worth it. James Rucard was on the return leg when he saw the first wave of Shermans pass him going the other way. The tankers waved. One threw him a captured German cigar. Rucard caught it one-handed and tucked it behind his ear like a mechanic's pencil. He did not smile. He was too tired for that. But something inside his chest loosened for the first time since Normandy. The German reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, recalled to command the Western Front after the July bomb plot, received frantic signals from every sector. American armor was moving again. faster than at any time since August, and there was nothing left to stop them. The panzer divisions that might have formed a counterstroke were themselves immobilized. The 11th Panzer Division, ordered north to seal the breach at Metz, reported it could move only 2 battalions of tanks because the rest were waiting for horses to drag fuel trailers forward. Those horses were dead in a field outside Luneville, bellies swollen, legs stiff in the frost. The division commander radioed Army Group G, request permission to slaughter remaining transport animals for meat and abandon all heavy equipment. Permission was granted. The 11th Panzer ceased to exist as a mobile formation that afternoon. In Berlin, Albert Speer's munitions ministry received a terse memorandum from the Chief of Army Transport. Effective 1 November 1944, the Wehrmacht has fallen below the minimum sustainable horse population required for winter defensive operations. Projected total collapse of animal transport by 31st of December. Speer read the report twice, then quietly closed the folder and placed it in the drawer marked irreversible. He understood, with the cold clarity of an engineer, that the war had just crossed a line from which there was no return. Germany was no longer fighting with insufficient industry. Germany was fighting with insufficient centuries. On the American side, the Red Ball reached its peak in the first week of November. Convoys ran nose to tail from dawn to dawn, headlights now permitted, because the front had moved so far that the old blackout rules no longer applied. The route extended all the way to the German border, 600 miles from the Normandy beaches. Depots that had been cow pastures in August were now cities of canned gasoline and artillery shells. French children lined the roads selling hot coffee for cigarettes. MPs with red balls painted on their helmets waved the trucks through intersections that had once been sleepy villages. The sound was constant, the growl of engines, the hiss of air brakes, the shouted jokes between drivers who had not seen each other in weeks but recognized the painted names on the doors. Hell on Wheels, Detroit Special, Sweet Jesus 2. Patton drove the front himself now, riding in an open jeep at the head of his armored columns, ivory-handled revolvers gleaming, scarf whipping in the wind like a cavalry pennant. He pushed his spearhead so fast that his own staff lost track of where the front actually was. On the 8th of November he entered Metz after a siege that had been expected to last until Christmas. On the 23rd of November, the 4th Armored reached the Saar River and looked across into Germany proper. Every mile had been paid for in gasoline delivered by the Red Ball, every bridge seized before it could be blown because the Germans had no fuel to move their demolition teams fast enough. By the end of November, the original Red Ball route was no longer enough. New express lines spun off like tributaries, the White Ball for rations, the Green Diamond for medical supplies, the ABC Highway for Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north. The concept had become doctrine overnight. Eisenhower issued a general order that would be studied in staff colleges for the next 80 years. The decisive factor in this campaign is sustained momentum. Momentum is sustained by supply. Supply is sustained by trucks. He underlined the last sentence 3 times. German prisoners taken during the November offensives told the same story over and over. They had expected the American advance to stall again as soon as winter set in. They had counted on the mud, the cold, the shortened days. Instead, they were overrun by tanks that never seemed to run out of fuel and infantry that advanced with hot food in their bellies. One captured major from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division asked his interrogator a question that haunted Allied intelligence for days. "Where do you keep your horses?" When told there were none, the German simply stared, as if the laws of physics had been rewritten while he wasn't looking. On the 1st of December 1944, exactly 98 days after it began, the Red Ball Express was officially discontinued. The railheads had finally caught up. The front had moved so far that trucks alone could no longer span the distance economically. The last convoy rolled back into Normandy under a light snow. The drivers parked their battered jimmies in long, silent rows, climbed down, and for the first time in 3 months, did not know what to do with their hands. Some sat on running boards and cried without sound. Others simply walked away into the dusk. They had moved 412,193 tons of supplies. They had driven 48 million miles. They had kept two armies in continuous motion for 3 straight months across a continent that had never seen anything faster than a horse. And in doing so, they had written the final chapter of a war that had begun with cavalry charges in Poland and ended with convoy schedules in France. Engines had beaten hooves, and the war shifted with them. The war ended, but the silence that followed was not the same for everyone. In the spring of 1945, the Red Ball trucks were lined up in depots outside Paris, their engines cold for the first time in a year. The red discs were painted over in fresh olive drab, as if the army wanted to forget the emergency that had forced it to depend on black soldiers driving day and night. The men themselves were scattered, some sent to the Pacific before Japan surrendered, others simply put on ships headed home with no parades, no speeches, no reporters asking what it felt like to have carried the liberation of Europe on their axles. James Rucard stepped off the train in Detroit wearing the same uniform he had worn in France. Only now it hung loose on a body that had forgotten how to sleep more than 3 hours at a stretch. The same city that had sent him away with segregated buses greeted him with segregated restaurants. He walked into a diner on Woodward Avenue looking for coffee and was told, "We don't serve colored here." He stood there for a long moment, smelling burnt grease and cigarette smoke, remembering the smell of burning gasoline outside Chartres and the way Willie Davis had screamed when the truck rolled over him. Then he turned around and walked out without a word. He never told his children about the Red Ball until the night Martin Luther King was killed, and even then he only spoke for 10 minutes before going silent again. Most of the drivers came home to the same country that had drafted them into segregated units. Their discharge papers listed truck driver under occupation, as if they had spent the war hauling oranges in California instead of keeping 2 armies alive across a continent. The citations they earned, Bronze Stars, commendations signed by Patton himself, were folded away in drawers because no one wanted to hear the stories. The photographs they brought back, grinning black soldiers leaning against jimmies with names like Double V and Separate but Equal My Ass, were hidden in shoeboxes under beds. History preferred its heroes in different colors. On the other side of the ocean, the German horse system finished dying in the snows of January 1945. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, panzer units that might have reached the Meuse ran out of fuel 50 kilometers short because the horse-to-horse supply columns behind them simply froze in place. One veteran of the 2nd Panzer Division remembered standing beside a dead Percheron, steam still rising from its nostrils, while American fighter bombers circled overhead like vultures. "We had shells," he said years later, "but no way to bring them forward except the way Napoleon did." And Napoleon never had to fight the United States Army. By V-Day, the Wehrmacht had slaughtered or lost more than 2 million horses on the eastern and western fronts combined. The survivors, a few thousand broken animals, were turned over to French and Belgian farmers, who shot most of them for meat rather than try to feed them through another winter. The great military equestrian tradition of Central Europe ended not with bugles, but with the dull thud of mercy killings in stable yards. In the summer of 1945, Dwight D. Eisenhower sat down to write the report that would shape American military thinking for the next 75 years. Crusade in Europe contains only a few paragraphs about the Red Ball Express, but those paragraphs are underlined in every copy that ever belonged to a logistics officer. Eisenhower wrote, "Modern warfare is simply a matter of keeping troops in motion. Everything else, courage, generalship, even firepower, becomes secondary if the soldier cannot be fed, fueled, and armed at the moment he needs it. We won in Europe because we solved the problem of sustained momentum, and we solved it with trucks and the men who drove them." That lesson became doctrine. The U.S. Army created the Transportation Corps as a major branch equal to infantry and armor. The Military Traffic Management Command, the Defense Logistics Agency, the airlift wings that would supply Berlin and Seoul and Saigon and Kabul, every one of them traces its spiritual lineage to a muddy road in France and a red grease pencil line drawn in desperation. NATO's entire deployment plan for the Central Front was built around the assumption that the side able to move 12,000 tons a day would win any war in Europe. They never had to test it, because the Soviet Union watched what happened to horses in 1944–45 and quietly began building truck factories instead of cavalry schools. The forgotten heroes grew old in a nation that slowly, painfully, began to remember. In 1981, a small plaque was dedicated at Fort Eustis, Virginia, listing the units of the Red Ball Express. In 2001, the French government awarded the Légion d'honneur to the last surviving drivers they could find. Most were in their 80s, some in wheelchairs, many accompanied by grandchildren who had never heard the stories before that day. James Rucard was there. He stood as straight as his back allowed and accepted the medal without tears. When a French general thanked him for liberating France, Rucard answered in the same quiet voice he had used in 1944. "Sir, we didn't liberate France. We just kept the gas coming so the tanks could." He died in 2009 at the age of 90, still rising every morning at 400 out of habit, still reaching for a steering wheel that was no longer there. The trucks themselves are almost all gone now. A few restored GMCs sit in museums with neat placards that never quite explain the smell of burnt oil and fear that clung to them. The roads they tore apart in France have been repaved a dozen times. If you stand on the old Red Ball route outside Alençon on a quiet autumn evening, you can almost hear it. The distant growl of 2,000 engines that refused to stop, the faint echo of hooves that could not keep up. The moral is brutally simple. Germany trusted the past. Bloodlines, tradition, the romance of horse and rider that had carried Prussian armies from Frederick to the Kaiser. They believed courage and discipline could force the world to move at the speed of a gallop. America built the future. Assembly lines, interchangeable parts, young men from sharecropper shacks and city tenements who were handed keys and told, "Keep it moving." They believed the world could be engineered into obedience, 1 gallon, 1 mile, 1 sleepless night at a time. 2.8 million horses tried to outrun 6,000 engines. They lost. Not because the German soldier was braver or the American soldier luckier. They lost because one side measured time in heartbeats and hoofbeats, and the other side measured it in revolutions per minute. Wars are remembered for battles, Normandy, Bastogne, Berlin, but they are won by those who can move. The drivers of the Red Ball Express never fired a shot in anger, never saw the Rhine, never stood on the balcony of a conquered capital. Yet, without them, none of the victories that followed would have been possible. They were the invisible army that carried freedom on 6 wheels and a prayer. And when the last engine finally went silent, the world had changed forever. Because once humanity learned that motion itself could be weaponized, there was no going back to the age of the horse. Victory belongs to the side that keeps moving. Subscribe for more Untold Wui 2 brilliance.